Little darlin', it's been a long, cold, lonely winter. But here comes the sun, soft, on NES Works Gaiden. Well, I'm afraid Rob and I goofed last episode. My production order list got scrambled, and so I got a few things out of the proper chronology for Famicom's history. What can you do?
10-Yard Fight wasn't actually Irem's first release for Famicom. Predating it by a month, Zippy Race actually came first. But the sentiment remains the same. This is not much of a debut. We've already seen Zippy Race over on Gaiden. Sega licensed it in as one of the first racing games for SG-1000. Now, here we have it as one of Famicom's earlier racing titles. What a difference a year makes. Zippy Race was honestly fairly impressive on Sega's console. Back when it shipped in March 1984, it didn't have a lot of competition over in Japan. Basically, the SG-1000 had MONACO GP, and that was about it. Famicom had no racers at that point, and anything that happened to trickle into the Japanese market on imported systems, like Intellivision and Atari 2800, was promptly ignored. Zippy Race's deliberate track design and showy perspective switching, in which each race ended with a behind-the-vehicle segment depicting the destination city ahead of the player's motorcycle rider, stood out in the Japanese console space. Whatever appeal Zippy Race may have had on SG-1000 largely evaporates for its Famicom release. Developed by TOSE for Irem, this interpretation of the arcade game makes a great first impression that it swiftly fails to deliver upon. On a technical level, Zippy Race for Famicom absolutely smokes the SG-1000 release, as you might expect. Not only does the racetrack scroll more smoothly, and the end race segments create a more convincing sense of 3D immersion, the sprites look more attractive and move with considerably more elegance than Sega's dev team managed to accomplish on their system. Particularly impressive is the player's motorcycle rider, who doesn't simply drive around with the rigidity of a plastic toy here, but instead leans into each lane change with a detailed animation cycle that gives him a lively sense of presence. Opposing cars lack much in the way of personality, but they are, after all, cars. And the simple fact that every sprite contains multiple colors places this Zippy Race rendition on a higher tier than that of Sega's. And that, I'm afraid, is about all that Zippy Race for Famicom offers over the SG-1000 rendition. The enhancements go as far as visuals and end there. The Famicom port somehow manages to be far more punishing and difficult than the SG-1000 game. Zippy Race is by nature a challenging racer. You ride the only motorcycle to be seen on a highway jam-packed with aggressive cars, any of which can destroy you. And they do their best to accomplish just that, by merely brushing against you. Meanwhile, drifting onto the highway's shoulder by so much as a pixel will cause your bike to wipe out, which, as in Konami's Road Fighter, wastes precious fuel. You have to complete a cross-country journey within the limitations of your fuel reserves, and once you run down your gas meter, the game ends. You lose fuel as you drive and when you wipe out, but you can only replenish your gas by driving over fuel icons along the road. This mechanic turns Zippy Race into an unforgiving test of memorization. The road forks and divides and throws tons of obstacles in your way, and there's no way to dart quickly to pick up an icon that you spot across the screen. Between the zoomed-in viewpoint, the dense and aggressive enemy cars that veer hatefully toward your bike, and the general stiffness of your vehicle's handling, Zippy Race doesn't really make it possible for you to play reactively beyond the moment-to-moment task of avoiding large passenger vehicles that inexplicably want to murder a guy on a bike. If you hope to advance beyond the second leg of your journey across the US, you need to commit the layout of the highway, and more to the point, the placement of fuel icons, to memory. Zippy Race had the poor luck to arrive 1 week after Road Fighter, a game that offers a similar experience with greater finesse. Sure, Zippy Race contains larger and more detailed graphics, but it doesn't move as convincingly, as quickly, or as fluidly as Road Fighter. Zippy Race lacks Road Fighter's sense of speed and the intensity of its twitch-based action, and most of all, it lacks Konami's top-flight skill at programming. So maybe 10-Yard Fight wasn't Irem's first Famicom effort, but maybe we'd all be happier if we pretended it was.
Anyway, we have another newcomer on the Famicom scene this week, a future mainstay of the NES and a tech savant, Sunsoft, although you might not guess it to go by this first freshman effort.
Sunsoft got its start about a decade before the Famicom's debut as Sandenshi, a company focused on electronics manufacturing and leasing. and it had naturally drifted into the arcade game business after Space Invaders hit it big. After all, what better machine format to lease than the icy hot, coin-operated video game? Sunsoft had enjoyed its first true hit with a Donkey Kong-inspired platformer called KANGAROO, which fared well both in Japan and abroad. Once the Famicom had become an undisputed moneymaker, Sunsoft naturally set its sights on the console market. Home conversions of KANGAROO had seen excellent sales on American consoles, but those games had been produced and distributed under license by other companies. On Famicom, Sunsoft intended to cut out the middleman and sell their own games. In fact, they intended to handle Famicom publishing from the ground up, including the development work. Where forensic research on game code has revealed that other arcade manufacturers like Taito and Irem appeared content to allow contract studios to handle the heavy lifting for their Famicom products, Sunsoft's engineers chose to handle the coding themselves, with the sole exception of this first release, which was developed for them by TOSE. Yeah, those guys are everywhere. Surprisingly though, Sunsoft chose not to jump into the Famicom market with a conversion of KANGAROO despite it being their biggest hit to date. This could have something to do with the arcade ports HAL Laboratory coded to help Nintendo court an international Famicom licensing deal with Atari. As mentioned several times on NES Works, HAL produced spec versions of 4 games to help Nintendo fulfill a potential distribution contract that would have seen Atari release the Famicom in the US. 3 of those games, Defender 2, Millipede, and Joust, eventually shipped under the HAL label, but the 4th never saw the light of day. That 4th is speculated to have been KANGAROO, and if so, that could explain why Sunsoft never released their biggest arcade hit on Famicom. And it could explain why HAL never shipped KANGAROO, since Sunsoft had its own internal publishing relationship with Nintendo, unlike Williams and Atari, the original makers of HAL's other Atari spec projects. Whatever the reason, Sunsoft skipped right past KANGAROO to make its Famicom debut with one of their own lesser arcade releases, Arabian. Drawing from the same deep well of superficial Orientalism that gave us Sega's SINDBAD Mystery, Arabian was a single-screen platformer that echoed the design of games like Nintendo's Popeye and Donkey Kong Jr., which is to say it dealt in some of the same concepts as KANGAROO, albeit with less panache. The Famicom adaptation more or less duplicates the structure and design of the coin-op game, tweaking a few elements and greatly downgrading the visuals. Set in ancient Persia, it follows the quest of a young prince, a prince of Persia, if you will, who seeks to rescue a princess by evading monsters and collecting letters. The letters appear scattered throughout 4 different stages, which include a sailing ship that resembles one of the stages Nintendo designed for Popeye, a series of caves that gives a bit of a spelunker vibe, and a horrible level in which you travel across flying carpets and clouds. You only need to collect all the letters in a stage to advance to the next level, but if you collect them in the correct order to spell a word, you'll receive a bonus. So I guess maybe a better point of reference for Arabian's design might be Popeye no EIGO ASOBI. Well, maybe not. But the letters do appear to factor into the change of title. In Arabian, you spelled the word Arabian in every level. Here you spell different words each time. That's super. Just kidding. Despite its new name, Super Arabian is not in fact super. It's a pretty low-grade, single-screen platformer, a genre that, along with shooters, already comprises the bulk of the Famicom library at this point. Super Arabian doesn't really offer anything we haven't seen in another better game like Donkey Kong Jr., or Ice Climber, or Popeye, or, well, you get the idea. Actually, the Clouds and Carpets stage manages to be more infuriating than the clunky jump physics in Ice Climber, which is quite an impressive feat. Not impressive in a good way, mind you, but impressive. It would be a while before Sunsoft would find its groove on NES, but eventually we'd get to the likes of Blaster Master and Batman. In the meantime, there's a lot of jank to power through. But hey, at least it's Sunsoft's own jank, which is more than you can say for certain other publishers.
Other publishers, such as Taito. Yes, we end this episode with another formative work from Taito, or rather, another shoddy conversion of a formative work by Taito. That always seems to be the way of things with Taito, doesn't it, Rob?
I haven't come across any information online that ties this adaptation of Frontline to any particular contractor. To this point, Taito has looked to Micronix and TOSE for their home console conversions, and their next game, Sky Destroyer, would be produced by Home Data, the same studio behind Irem's Squoon. But who made Frontline? In this case, I think the correct answer is, who cares who made Frontline? Sometimes it's best to just let someone disassociate themselves from a less than stellar work. To do an Alan Smithy on their development credits. Frontline on Famicom may be a painful mess to play, but you can hardly blame whoever was given the assignment. There's only so much you can do when the deck is tilted against you like this. In a sort of foretaste of tragic things to come with Ikari Warriors, Frontline brings a vertical top-down military shooter that employed a complex custom controller to the stripped-down Famicom D-pad, and generally fails at it. But before we excoriate Frontline for its dismal outcome, we should take a moment to appreciate the fact that this game helped shape an entire genre. Commando, Ikari Warriors, Iron Tank, Super Tank, Ninja Princess, JACKAL. Would any of those games exist without Frontline to set an example for the format? Well, probably, but Taito got here first, giving players a little guy with a gun and grenades forced to wade through a violent battlefield viewed from above. It's really remarkable how much Frontline got right way back in 1982. Taito more or less defined the future of the top-down military shooter genre in their first go. You move a soldier about the battlefield, and unlike in other shooters of the era, the screen only scrolls forward as your soldier does. You have two forms of attack. Enemies attack from all directions, but you can turn the tables by hopping into a tank whose high-powered cannon makes short work of anything in its path. The tank will explode when hit, but if you hop out of the tank before it detonates, you can safely advance, or even hop back into the tank, which somehow will have recovered in the interim. Every single one of these points would appear in future NES top-down shooters, from the balance of omnidirectional plus forward-only attacks to the ability to make use of heavy armor. And SNK would definitely take inspiration from Frontline's oddball control scheme when designing Ikari Warriors, improving on what Taito created here in fine style. Frontline's arcade controller shared a great deal in common with the one Midway concocted for TRON around the same time that Frontline debuted, a seeming case of convergent evolution. Players could move their soldier around with an 8-way joystick, but they controlled the direction of his weapon fire, or his tank turret, with a rotary spinner that could be depressed to fire. The only console controller that could have potentially reproduced this setup, I think, might have been the Fairchild Channel Fs. The Famicom's not so much. The loss of independent movement and aim controls greatly restricts Frontline's gameplay, though I will say it suffers less than Ikari Warriors thanks to the fact that your soldier doesn't have to cycle through an entire rotation animation to change the direction in which he aims at enemies. Still, this release does fall very much into the category of Famicom jank. We've mostly seen excellent games on the system so far, but with 3 fairly dire arcade ports in a row this episode, we've hit a turning point for Famicom. From here on out, the system's hit-to-miss ratio wouldn't look nearly so favorable as it did during the console's first 2 years on the market. The best third-party publishers will deliver games that exceed even Nintendo's own, but most of the rest will strain the patience of even young players who had yet to develop a proper sense of taste.
Next time on NES Works Gaiden, an actual formative game.